Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to the INHOPE Expert Insights webinar, CSAM's Gordian Knot, Challenges and Opportunities in Financial Intelligence. My name is Anastasia Dika. I'm INHOPE's Communications Manager, and I'll be emceeing today's event. And before we get started and before I introduce our wonderful speakers for today, I'd like to take you through some guidelines for this webinar. So we will be recording this webinar for note-taking purposes. And as usual, the content of this webinar may be sensitive in nature, so please be aware of your surroundings and make sure that nobody else has access to your screen. All of our participants are muted today with the video disabled, but we do want you to engage and ask questions. So we have the Q&A function for that, and we'll make sure to answer all of your questions towards the end of the webinar. If any of your questions remain unaddressed due to lack of time, please send them through to communications@inhope.org, and we'll make sure to get back to you as soon as possible. So let me briefly introduce our wonderful speakers before I hand over to them. Our host, Henry Adams, has over a decade of experience in trust and safety and is the director at Resolver Trust and Safety. Sally Frank is the anti-human exploitation manager at Block, and she has a decade of experience supporting child exploitation investigations globally as a criminal analyst, advocate, and law enforcement trainer. And last but not least, Megan Gonzales is the global head of financial crimes at Block and has over 15 years of experience combined working in fintech and the public sector as a former law enforcement professional. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll hand over to Henry.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Anastasia. Thank you to the nearly 100 of you who've already joined. It is super to see that level of interest and frankly on time, because I know anyone involved in the broader world of online safety are busy people, and if you're anything like me, you're going back to back. So thank you for giving us your time over the next hour. And a crucial thank you to INHOPE, of course. Resolver are incredibly proud to be gold partners and 10-year-long supporters of INHOPE, and we're really pleased that we could help bring back the Expert Insights series. For those of you that have attended the first couple, or if you've attended none of those, first we started with Pinterest, then we moved to Roblox, and now we close out this year's series, I'm very pleased to say, with our friends from Block. Little bit of history. The joy for me of operating in this world is that you meet people doing interesting things in interesting places. I first met Megan back at the Crimes Against Children conference in Dallas. I then met Sally at the brilliant INHOPE Summit, which will be coming up again in just a few months' time. So do register for that. With those introductions out the way, let's get started. What are we talking about? Financial intelligence. Some of you on this call will perhaps be deeply experienced. Maybe that's all you do in the world of child safety. Maybe you do financial intelligence, but not in child safety, and you're intrigued at the potential for overlap between what are often seen, perceived, and reality can be quite different disciplines, but it's crucial. While we know that the volume of CSAM trading, grooming, or other related harms that are transacted for financial reasons do remain a relatively small proportion of the overall child safety and CSAM challenge, it is nonetheless a growing and incredibly pernicious challenge. I am therefore thrilled to be joined by Sally and Megan as we tackle both what are we doing about this, what are some of the challenges, and maybe crucially, what are the opportunities that we can do together as partners in a wider ecosystem, because sure as anything, we cannot tackle this alone. Let's start with some introductions. First, a little bit about myself. I enjoy these days to be Director of Trust and Safety at Resolver. If you hadn't heard of us before, we were better known for a good 15 years as CRISP. We've spent 20 years with our founding mission to protect children online, really by gathering, sharing the most actionable intelligence that you can find. Now, Megan, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself. tell us a little bit about your origin story, because certainly I know I like to hear these things. And of course, tell us what you now do at Block.
Sure. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's wonderful to be able to have a platform to talk about the things that we're doing to combat this activity in this space. As Anastasia mentioned, I'm currently the global head of financial crimes for Block. Block's a financial services and technology company. Our financial services products include Square, Cash App, and Afterpay. And in my role there, I oversee the financial crimes compliance function, which includes our AML, which is anti-money laundering, our counter-terrorist financing, know your customer sanctions compliance, and also our detections policies and programs. In addition to that, we also have an intelligence program, which includes our special investigations unit. There's probably many faces on this call that have interacted with them. They're responsible for high-risk investigations and managing our external relationships, such as law enforcement and non-governmental agencies. I've worked for almost actually 20 years between the public and the private sector throughout compliance and risk. And, my origin story is I started in law enforcement. I was with PayPal for over a decade before coming to Block. And this topic, I learned more about in the financial services sector, and it really started to intersect with my background in law enforcement. And so connecting the financial aspect of it and how we can aid law enforcement in a different way of being able to track not only to identify the financial aspect, but also to identify the perpetrators and victims that may be involved in these scenarios beyond just what we can see on the platform. And so I'm very passionate about this topic. I've helped to build groups within both of the companies that I've worked at when it comes to these types of investigations. And I'm also a mom to 2 young children. So it brings even more to life the importance of this topic and being able to apply my experience in helping to be part of this fight. So thanks again for the opportunity to discuss this issue, and looking forward to the topics today.
Supremely well put. Sally, over to you.
Thanks, Henry. Big shoes to follow. But hi, everyone. I'm Sally. I am Block's anti-human exploitation program manager, but I started in this field around 10 years ago at the Dallas Children's Advocacy Center. If you've been to the Crimes Conference in Dallas, it's the CAC that hosts that conference. And so I spent my first 4 years in a role there supporting Dallas Police's child exploitation units. And so I've always really loved that. I think my career began at this very ground level of understanding how these cases play out in a true multidisciplinary team. From there, I moved up to DC. I spent a few years at NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, as an analyst on their child sex trafficking team. And most recently, before coming to Block about 9 months ago, I spent almost 3 years working for IJM, International Justice Mission, who I know, given the global audience of this call, many of you are familiar with. I worked on their Center to End Online Sexual Exploitation of Children team, where I led projects in countries around the world, supported our teams in the Philippines on live stream sexual abuse of children, and did a lot of work in West Africa, where right at the time we were kind of seeing this burst of financial sextortion. So it's really interesting, I think, for me to kind of bring this amalgamation of perspectives from the local level of like, how do these cases play out, to the NCMEC perspective, and then to this international perspective of what are the barriers that law enforcement face around the world when trying to investigate and prosecute CSAM cases, and then to come to the private sector and bring all that together. For me, a lot of my work at Block is focused on our detections work and our investigations teams and supporting them. But it's really this cross organization support of any team, which is every team that touches this topic. And I think for me, spoiler of what we're maybe going to get into in a bit, is it's been so fascinating to not really just see it from what can we do at Block, but so much of my historical work was on bringing together ecosystem gaps and like spotting where there's opportunity for us all to work together a little better, to solve problems. And I think there are so many when it comes to financial intelligence and financial institutions and the child safety space. And I'm so curious when we get into the conversation of where do those gaps exist and how can we maybe all work to close them?
100%. Well, on that note, let's dive right in. Let's start with some fundamentals. I think Megan will kick off with you. What do we mean in general, but also specifically in child safety, when we talk about financial intelligence, and maybe bring it to life a bit and talk us through how you use this in Block?
Yes. So financial intelligence essentially is, I think about it as the information that we can leverage when it comes to trying to detect this type of activity. And so starting with when a customer onboards and begins to use our products, that monitoring continues through the life cycle as part of assessing risk and money movement and the other risk signals that are associated with understanding our customers. And to effectively manage that activity on Block, we leverage a combination of upfront product controls, real-time machine learning evaluations, as well as different kinds of adverse action levers, such as blocking payments, account suspensions, and post-transaction monitoring. All of this is supported by dedicated teams that continuously evaluate activity and adjust based on new and emerging vectors of risk. And I think that part is so key, because we often see as we build more upfront friction to try to prevent the bad activity from happening on the platform, or intended use cases of how we want the product to be used, bad actors, perpetrators will often evolve and try to circumvent those things. So continuing to ensure that we understand what those emerging vectors of risk or things that change are really critical in that process. And then once customers are using those products, they're continuously monitored by risk and compliance machine learning models and systems. We use machine learning models to analyze and monitor the transactions, logins, and all types of activity, including linking financial instruments. And I'm so impressed with the machine learning models as I'm not a technology person. I'm an investigator at heart. Come from the compliance field. And so as I've worked for Block and working with our machine learning models, the sophistication they have in being able to build these types of detections and working closely with the experts in the team for these different typologies is something that continues to impress me as they evolve with it. We also have dedicated monitoring to look for those high-risk typologies, so associated with child exploitation, such as child sex trafficking and the distribution of CSAM material. And as I talk about all of the things across the company, that really evolved into our anti-human exploitation strategy that becomes kind of that critical element within our financial, as we talk about financial intelligence. It has to be multidimensional in order to address the risks that are associated with CSAM, both on and off the platform, including internal policies, processes, and controls, and then external partnerships and engagements, which have been a heavy focus and investment through my time at Block. And what I mean by that with those internal policies and processes are essentially the mechanisms that we use between our product risk and compliance teams to manage and detect these risks associated with this type of activity. It also includes how we staff to ensure that we've got the right investments and resources to have those appropriate measures in place. And that includes hiring Sally, who has an incredible background on this topic, and I feel incredibly grateful to work with. You'll hear from her today on why she's so brilliant and why we're so excited to have her as part of the team. It also includes our specialized training. So to help our investigators identify those red flags, as we detect those things, it's important to understand what you're looking at and being able to put those pieces of the puzzle together. All of those red flags, as we call them, so they're the little pieces of the puzzle that in aggregate can tell us this is what we believe this activity to be and what is the reason that we would report either in a SAR filing or through the NCMEC cyber tip line. The external partnerships piece is where our strategy is centered around law enforcement and NGOs and aiding our teams in combating industry-wide issues such as CSAM. And overall, with proactive intelligence through those external partnerships, it's not just to identify activity and report it, but we also proactively leverage that through the external intelligence we gain to assess the risk on our platform, which then informs the product controls and our compliance and risk oversight. So it's really an end-to-end thing that is a continual feedback loop where we're not just looking at the data and intelligence on our platform, but also externally at those trends and using that to continuously learn.
Whoa. Comprehensive is the word I was thinking, and I'm glad you finished it with the phrase end to end. Well, let's dig in a little bit more into that, because and from my point of view, it's really refreshing actually. Often when we get into these conversations, we're talking about what a service or a platform's policy is. You're clearly explicitly one level above that, in that you're talking about, and forgive me for an old law enforcement phrase, but your control strategy. And it's all encompassing, and it's also external signals, and then it comes together. It obviously needs good, solid, workable policy, but there's a lot below that too. Sally, a follow up on this one before we get into the next slide. Clearly, part of the strategy is bring in Sally, which as a tagline I think is fantastic, would recommend. But obviously then a big part of what you're coming in to do is to translate some of your own expertise into that training program of the many other pieces of the jigsaw that Megan introed. What was that like for you coming in those first few months?
Yeah, great question. I think it was really interesting coming in because so many of the things that Megan just described make so much sense. But when I came in, I'm so used to, like, I've spent 10 years on the image side of this crime, I imagine, like many people on this call. And so I think I'm so hyper familiar with things that I would put in place to detect images, but I was unfamiliar with a lot of what Megan has described, what we do with machine learning regarding financial transactions, especially transaction monitoring. And so it really quickly became, one, catching up to all of the work that Block is already doing, but two, kind of learning how to translate that for the rest of the field, who I think comes into this with the same historical perspective that I do. For example, the question that we really get the most often, especially when we're talking to law enforcement about our leads, is, okay, so what? You made a guess that it's a CSAM transaction. A guess is not enough to help me in my investigation. And I think that really undercuts all of like the actual science happening with the machine learning processes, right? I mean, a guess is such a simplified way to explain the models that we have in place to try to detect that, the same way that you would detect, grooming language or something like that on another platform, right? We're just talking about financial transactions here. And so I think it was one, for me, the first few months were really about truly understanding the systems that Block already had in place, but then really quickly trying to learn, okay, how do we translate this to a field who historically doesn't talk about money? I know we definitely all have in the last 2 years with the boom of financial sextortion, but if you think about this crime 10, 15 years ago, we're really talking about an image for an image crime. We're talking about trading. We're not talking about the monetization or like the commercialization of CSAM. And so I think as we are catching up to where the field is in some ways going, it's also learning how to translate back and forth in a way. And sometimes I think that's what my role has become in a small way. I think I'm doing a lot of other things, but almost that translation piece is so needed between financial institutions and child safety, who are, I think, running in the same direction, but not always communicating in the same language.
100%. Well, and we've got pretty different visibility too, right? I mean, it's funny listening to you talk about translation between those two fields. As someone who is now in pure, if you like, trust and safety, at least to use the industry term, that's a job that's translation. You're translating the engineering language, where we might be talking about entropy, percolation theory, degrees of connectedness, various ways to approach, measure, disrupt networks of bad actors, and even verify that we've got to the nth degree. all the way through to the almost that more abstract language of sort of edge case, non-policy violative. We need the abstract language so that we know what we're talking about. But then for the world of policy and public policy, it has to get real human, real fast. And of course, for law enforcement, we have to get to the minor that we want to safeguard and the predator ultimately that we need to remove from that position of doing or causing harm. But I think that moves us quite nicely along then to the next topic. Clearly, there are lots of opportunities, but maybe first let's start with some more of those challenges. Sally, you started us off quite well, so take us either upstream or downstream, or a bit of both. But as you're starting to use these in general, and of course, particularly within Cash App, what are some of these barriers that you're now starting to overcome?
Yeah, I think we'll go down upstream. I think kind of picking up where I was. So in that translation conversation and in both the internal and external training that we've been really focusing on, that internal training of our teams here, whether that's investigators, whether that's our product teams, but our external trainings for law enforcement too. I think what we've really quickly seen is that one, so as Megan mentioned, Block is reporting to NCMEC and our regulator, where we would report suspicious activity reports. But I think what's really interesting is, so we began reporting to NCMEC last year at the end of the year. We have historically been reporting to our regulator. And I think one of the things that we have quickly seen as this year, one of our targets has been really getting in front of US law enforcement handling CSAM cases and having conversations about these cases, about our leads, about how this is happening on our product, but maybe how they're seeing it elsewhere and how we can work together. One of the things we really quickly have realized is that most law enforcement in the United States, at least, don't have access to financial intelligence directly. And so they had actually never seen any of the historical information that Block had been reporting. I don't want to say never, but a large portion of them really, really struggle with direct access. And so that one became the quick part of the conversation of, oh, okay, well then we want you to be able to see all the information that we're reporting out. And what is the key? One, cyber tip line reporting is a huge part of that solution. But two, there's still a barrier there that they should be able to access the suspicious activity reporting as well, right? Those can be pieces that go together to support law enforcement. And so I think it became this question of why is access a barrier? And then once we continued to work through that problem and troubleshoot it, we really hit this second quick kind of ecosystem gap of, I got calls from a lot of law enforcement who would call us and say, great, we've got it in front of us. What am I supposed to do with this lead that you sent me that doesn't actually have any CSAM? These are transactions. I don't have probable cause. I don't have any image. You actually don't know if there's an image. Again, you're quote unquote guessing. And so a lot of that, I think, is training. I think one thing that I really appreciated and really loved about the team at Block is that they've never hesitated when we have a new whole plan that's like, okay, great, we're going to go do this. And by the way, the second part of the plan is now we also need to train these law enforcement officers how to understand our intelligence. But I think there is a larger gap there, right? We can all day long fill in part of that gap, but I think there are so many opportunities for more training in the United States. And I would imagine that echoes in every other country, right? I know this is a global audience, and Cash App is a US product, which is why I'm talking about US law enforcement. But I have no doubt that that system gap doesn't echo across the globe. And so again, as this crime becomes more financially motivated, are we training law enforcement how to access financial intelligence? Are we training law enforcement how to action it and how to follow it? We're talking really specifically about CSAM right now, but what we've seen are that investigators who handle child sex trafficking and more of those in-person trafficking offenses tend to understand financial intelligence better. They've had training on it. They know how to access it because that crime has for so long had a financial nexus. And so how do we begin to match maybe some of these pieces together where half of our field has caught up to this and half of us kind of is almost at this, I don't know, I don't want to say forefront because it feels like we're very much behind the offenders, right? The offenders are at the forefront, but in many ways, how can we as a field catch up to where the offenders have started to use money in CSAM, and really try to not only on the company side build controls, build detection, report in a solid way, but make sure the rest of the ecosystem knows how to receive, access, and action that information as well.
Yeah, it's well put, and I would agree with you that this absolutely has global relevance. I'm thinking back to when I was in Scotland Yard, thinking back to working counterterrorism, and in those kind of verticals, as I would call them now, and other places and spaces, you have your team that deals with the, if you like, day to day. I hesitate to say the word straightforward because show me a job that is straightforward. But then you would often have those dedicated and separate FIUs, your financial intelligence units, who are dedicated to looking at those things. And as you say, we've got used to a really effective working relationship in OCGs and organized criminal networks, reasonably good for various types of counterterrorism. It does feel like now with the upsurge in transacting and this real upsurge in what we're calling these middlemen, these individuals, and it's worth noting, although it's not a focus of today's topic, that this is also true for AI-generated CSAM, where we're seeing people who are happy to be paid to either produce bespoke material, bespoke images, in some cases bespoke videos, and they're looking really broadly at any financial service. It's less about the service and more about trying as many doors as they can. And it's something we often see with our off-platform intelligence, where someone will offer payment options, and I stress the plural of options there, and they'll give vouchers from lots of different platforms. They'll try in all sorts of different ways to facilitate that. And from our end, that's actually really tricky because, to your point, let alone a platform reporting to law enforcement, in those cases, Resolver is reporting what to a platform? Someone is selling something. Now, we know what that thing is, but whether there's any information on the platform is another question. So there's a real, I think, context challenge. We all have our little bits of intelligence, but it strikes me it's only when we can add it together that we really have a evidential force multiplier. I feel for those right at the other end, those trying to convince juries and trying to bring that level of persuasion, impact to what can often be a pretty dry subject in the world of financial intelligence. Well, that's probably more than enough about some of the challenges and, of course, what Block in particular is doing to mitigate those. Let's talk opportunities. Megan, we'll pass back to you. There's clearly a world of collective action we can take. Maybe let's start a little bit closer to home and we can branch out from there.
Sure, yes. A lot of opportunities. I think the one that jumps out to me immediately is thinking about the differences, kind of adding on to what you're saying about this activity happens on multiple platforms, and we all have a little piece of that puzzle. And so the challenge does become being able to understand, whether it's a transaction or, if you have more information, a background of your customer, to try to put it together, being able to put that together. And then when you add in the regulatory obligations and legal liabilities, that there are differences between a financial institution and, say, a social media company or internet service provider. While we have the SAR reporting process, as Sally highlighted, not all law enforcement investigators have access to that database. And so when you combine that with some of those differences in those regulatory obligations, where we've got stringent reporting requirements, we've got stricter timeframes, higher documentation burden, more complex regulatory examination requirements as well, and that need to focus on the financial nexus of CSAM activity. I think those are some of the things that are important factors to consider as we're trying to navigate through. At the end of the day, how do we find this activity? How do we make it hard to use our platform? And how do we put that in the right hands of law enforcement to ultimately put cuffs and put those offenders away so that they can no longer hurt children? And so I think those are some of those key things. On top of that, I actually want to hand it over to Sally, because this was a topic as we were preparing for this call. Between our collective experience, Sally brings some great points from her prior roles that are very relevant as we look at how this impacts Block.
Yeah, I think for me, I found myself so many times this year, if I can be brutally honest, kind of wondering, and in my time before I came to this role, did I ever have like where in all of the meetings and all of the task force and all of the roundtables and working groups that I was part of in the last decade, was I always reaching out and thinking of and inclusive of financial institutions? And sometimes the answer is yes, right? Like Block, I'm grateful to anyone and everyone who's invited Block to the table historically or in my 9 months here. But I do think there is more opportunity, right? I think whether that are working groups, the Tech Coalition, we're members of the Tech Coalition and they have phenomenal working groups. But I think beyond the Tech Coalition, whether it's, safety by design workshops, whether it is working groups related to policy or legislature, as Megan pointed out, we have such a unique space with social media versus fintech, and where is this overlap? But I think a lot of the child safety legislation really focuses on social media companies, and it kind of leaves financial institutions out of the conversation. On the flip side, our regulators can be a little more focused on fraud and money laundering, market stability, and kind of overlook the critical role that advancing child safety within that financial ecosystem might be needed. And so as we're kind of pulled in multiple directions, I wonder where there's opportunity for almost alignment of government, alignment of stakeholders. I think child exploitation is only going to increasingly become financially, unfortunately, motivated or involved. And so I wonder, as we all move forward, how can we include financial institutions in conversations? And how can we consider them when we are working on legislation, right? One of the things that was interesting to me when I started here, and interesting is a nice word, one of the things that was hard, it was trying to figure out where do we fit in between these two worlds, and which guidance. We obviously need to follow the guidance of our regulator. We are very concerned about child safety, and we're going to do what we need to do here. But it'd be so great if those things were aligned and clear. We can't be the only financial institution with that curiosity. So again, whether it's United States or elsewhere, are we bringing all of the stakeholders to every conversation?
Yeah, it's so well put, and it's interesting because I spend a lot of my time talking in various fora about what I call true proactive trust and safety. You have demonstrated or well encapsulated there some of the challenges with doing proactive trust and safety is there aren't necessarily guardrails or even high-level principles for some of the work. I mean, particularly in the case of Cash App and Block, where you're really leaning in, arguably in a pretty voluntary way, to pretty aggressively put friction into the platform and go after folks and share that information to the right institutions. Well, you've heard it loud and clear, folks. If you have a table and financial services aren't on it, then someone from Block very much would like to be. The other bit I thought that you make an interesting comment on there, Sally, is, yeah, if you ask anyone about systemic risk and financial institutions, they think about too big to fail, they think about boom and bust, they think about the underlying macroeconomics, possibly not nearly enough in terms of human harms, human risks, child safety in particular. Now, earlier you mentioned the Tech Coalition. Actually, that's a great one to lean back into, because beyond, and maybe I can break it down this way, there's tables that we're at that are policy, public policy. There's tables that we're at which are sharing, how did you build that? And in fact, there's so much more I think we can do as an industry on getting engineers together. In fact, I have no doubt that some of the creative machine learning you guys have done is going to be extremely impressive, given there aren't images, that you're finding a whole range of other signals to try and detect predation and shut things down. But then there's also signal sharing in and of itself, and arguably that's the very precipice of what we can call proactive trust and safety right now. Block are one of the very small number of financial services participants within the Lantern program. So does one of you want to tell us a little bit more about what that looks and feels like for you?
I can take that one, and it's one that I am personally incredibly proud of, all of the work that our team is doing to be part of this, and just the support from the Tech Coalition in creating this type of signal sharing. Since we know it manifests across multiple platforms, it does prevent individual companies from seeing and solving that problem alone. And so the Project Lantern through the Tech Coalition allows technology companies to securely share information or signals, as we call it, about activity and accounts that violate their policies against CSAM. And then those companies with access to the signals like ours can use them to better understand and investigate activity on our platform. And use them to uncover threats, even in real time. And so we joined in August of last year as one of the first financial institutions to join this pilot. Signals highlight the instances too where our own internal detections are not alerting on certain patterns. It's also at times validated our own internal alerts. And so, as we know, sometimes they can be difficult to action from a financial perspective just because we don't have that visibility into the imagery or the chats, at least outside of any external research we can find. We found that we often need as much extra context as possible from our partners to understand how that activity seen on our platforms can be tied to that financial nexus. And with that feedback loop, really creating that ability to then build our own rules and build upon that, especially as we look at where there may be overlap. If we've identified one person that may be purchasing this, what's that connection there that we can build upon those things? So it's not just about, where you often see the public-private sector participating in sharing intelligence, which is something that we're very much invested in and is of value, especially as we look at offenders trying to circumvent our controls. But the private to private signal sharing is something that is new and you don't see as often. And this allows us, Project Lantern allows us to really start to dig into those things and work together. Our Special Investigations Unit is one of those key internal groups that ingest those signals, not just from law enforcement, but as part of Project Lantern.
As you say, a really welcome, I think, needed and really encouraging to see this expansion beyond core tech particularly into financial institutions, especially from Resolver's point of view, because we do informal signal sharing all day long, all week long, all year long. When our analysts find bad actors like this, we often alert, in fact, we always, I would say, alert every platform we see impacted. And of course, we know ultimately some of that is feeding into other and existing signal sharing programs, ultimately into better quality referrals into NICMIC, more triageable from their point of view to law enforcement, better cases, stronger outcomes, more jail time. It's the whole system piece that I know, particularly the three of us having that broader perspective, given the way our careers have meandered so far, have gone. And actually, I think, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just say, just to add to that, this is also through signal sharing, whether it's with the private or the public sector or other private companies, is where we've seen these CSAM trends evolve. And so that, as Sally mentioned, that financially motivated element is not just about offenders wanting to purchase content for their own consumption or even their own trading, but we're seeing involvement in scamming related to that. And so it's almost like another element in a scammer's business model, whereas they're trying to sell CSAM content, whether selling it or not, but ultimately scamming somebody out of it as well. And so these collaborations are critical to us continuing to understand how people are changing their behaviors and allowing us to adjust our internal controls in line with that.
It's a really good point, actually. And I don't think we say it enough that one technical policy or whole strategy solution to an element of child safety can be just as relevant to a range of other risks, be that firearms, drugs, graphic violence, you name it. The human behavior that can be detected, mitigated, incredibly valuable. Let's go from what feels like what was the biggest picture question of the ecosystem. Let's close it personal, and then we'll open up the Q&A. And this is, I would say, your 60-second warning. If you have questions for Sally, Megan, maybe even me, or generally, given the three of us that we've got here, get typing, and the INHOPE team will start reviewing those. Let's start, or end rather, with celebrating success, because it's traditionally not something we're very good at in trust and safety, partly because I think we're gluttons for punishment, partly because most of us have come from law enforcement, and you celebrate when the case is closed and you move straight on to the next, and there's always a mountain to tackle. But let's take that minute. Megan, let's start with you. From your work in this space, what are you most proud of?
So many things. Whether it's law enforcement or working in compliance, we often work in the shadows. And, the work is not always openly celebrated because sometimes we can't. And so that behind the scenes work is so critical to having an impact. And so, whether it's working in financial crimes, working in other areas of the business, I think we all play a part in protecting vulnerable people. I'm really proud of our anti-human exploitation strategy. It goes beyond traditional monitoring, combining that detection with thoughtful investigations, and it always keeps that human impact central. I get energized by educating others, learning myself. I'm constantly trying to seek new information about how CSAM is evolving and how we can stay ahead of it, how we can train our teams, and how we can collaborate, and really how we're able to work across the business. This isn't just a financial crimes conversation at Block. I'm incredibly proud that, our company is committed to this mission, and we work closely with our product teams who often are not aware of these types of things. And not only do we educate them on that, but they are just as passionate about building more upfront controls to be able to create that friction and be able to prevent this activity, not just about detecting it and reporting it, but truly trying to stop it on our platform. So proud of what we build and all those dedicated people that, every success, every disrupted network, every prevented transactions means that real people are protected. And I'm very passionate about those efforts. And so I just want to say thank you to INHOPE and Revolver for this opportunity to have this conversation and provide more information and education to those attending this call.
And for the second time, good luck following that, Sally.
I know, right? Gosh, Henry, what you said is also really resonating just around how it can feel so challenging, I think, in this field to find success, right? I think so much of this field is about redefining success. And so for me, I would say in the last decade, I've spent a substantial amount of time in the US, but and also a substantial amount of time in countries around the world looking at this problem in the face. And I think I'm just so proud to be part of a field that really means it when they say a global problem requires a global solution. I'm just proud to be part of this community in any way. I think, INHOPE represents this global community so well, right? That is exactly what this global effort is. And so I think, when we say, the phrase that I always like to lean on is, and I don't know who originally said this, but the phrase, there's no such thing as other people's children, right? Like every child is all of ours to protect. And so I think I am proud to be in a role yet again. I feel so lucky to have been in roles my whole career where my leadership is willing to lean in on that concept. And so I feel really proud and lucky to be on a team right now that as the last 9 months of, I think, my chaos whirlwind here have been me saying okay, we need to do this thing. Maybe it's, it's report this in this way, but all of a sudden now my next task is, hey, we actually need to go retrain all of law enforcement how to do this. That's so beyond the scope of our role in a way, but it's not, because that's this field. All of this is all of our job. And so I'm proud of this field. I am really grateful for my leadership, who is really willing to equally kind of be part of the chaos of the child exploitation space.
Well, Megan, Sally, super answers. That was the one bit we did zero prep on because I just wanted to hear it for the first time along with the rest of you, and I'm glad we did it that way. All right. Thank you very much for making the way through to Q&A. Anastasia, we'll pass back to you to guide us through, or if we don't yet have some, to jivvy the crowd into putting some in the Q&A box.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you all of you for this amazing conversation. And we already have the first question. It's from Olivier Crochet. And first of all, he says, congratulations to the three of you for your work. To the best of my knowledge, no financial institutions have been fined or convicted for CSAM-related breaches. So how can top management be involved to initiate a willingness to fight against these crimes? At Block, what was the genesis of this fight against CSAM, and how did you manage to involve the top management?
Yeah, I can take this.
Really? Oh, you go right ahead, Megan.
Oh, sorry. I didn't know if you were doling them out. This one, I want to take it because I think this one is near and dear to my heart, because top management is not often in the trenches. And so oftentimes they don't know what they know. And so leveraging your board and your board reporting as an opportunity, not only to do your business readout every quarter that you're talking about of your business, and within the financial crime space, we're regularly reading out on where we're seeing the risks and what we're seeing and how we're addressing that, how our controls are effective. And we also do training for our board to be able to educate them. So I would say getting that buy-in from the top down is something that I've felt from the beginning. And it's one of the reasons that I joined Block, was the ability to be able to really build a program around this space, and education was the key. Being able to take the understanding of the risks, how it's manifesting on our platform, and how that impacts our business, whether it's regulatory obligations, which while there may not necessarily be fines specific to that, we are regularly examined on our AML program, and this is CSAM is part of that. Being able to address those risks in a timely manner, being able to ensure that we can detect those things are key. And so getting that top-down buy-in and creating that overall culture, I think education is critical, and also across the business to help our teams that are building that upfront friction, whether it's engineers or product teams that are building new products and launching them, making sure that they're educated and understand what that is, especially on a topic like this, gets that buy-in.
I'd
That's
also
funny,
add, oh, sorry, Henry. I was going to say, if it also helps to the person who asked this question, I know you said that that to your knowledge, no institutions have been fined. I would say if you look outside of the United States, there are regulators in other countries who have fined institutions related to CSAM. And so if it helps to have that kind of, I don't know, something to point to whoever you're making this point to, you might find that outside of the United States.
Yeah, for sure. It's an interesting one in that there is, and I would phrase it this way, clearly an opportunity, and Block are far and ahead leading the charge, for financial institutions to demonstrate what is possible in what is evidently, for the most part, I hesitate to use the word voluntary, but way beyond what a regulator or regulations are currently requiring, and then set the scene for what the rest of the industry can do. Because, I mean, sure as anything, 1, 2, 3 financial institutions making a safer place is material, but clearly the whole of the rest of the industry coming together is of course what we all want to see.
The next question actually touches perfectly onto these opportunities. So it was mentioned a couple of times that financial involvement is quite new in this whole sphere of child sexual abuse material, and that if we look back a couple of years, that financial companies were not really in the game, as we can say. And how do you see the role of financial intelligence evolving, or how do you want to see it evolving in combating crimes against children? You've obviously spoken about things like trainings for law enforcement and stronger involvement of other financial companies and getting them educating them to see the issue. Where would you like to see this ecosystem grow?
It feels like, and I'm sure there'll be a view from the two of you, there's kind of two questions there, and I might give an answer to what I think is the first one, but let me set out both of them. There is, what's the role of financial intelligence for the future of trust and safety? And there's, what's the role of financial institutions in the work to protect children and online safety? And those are different things. So Resolver, for example, is an intelligence provider. Increasingly, financial intelligence is a part of our repertoire because it is what bad actors, in particular predators and child-related offenders, are using as part of their tradecraft or part of their motivation. Sally referenced earlier that the spike we've seen in financially motivated sexual extortion, and I won't use the portmanteau because I don't like it very much, but it's a good example of where we need to tool up in a way that we haven't before. And actually, that's not so much about financial institutions, that's about across the ecosystem it's not just a specialist's question, it's a generalist's question. If you're doing work in child safety, what do you have on the table that's a capability to understand, to analyze, albeit maybe not at a specialist level, but at least to see that you need to bring in someone with a financial intelligence skill set, whether or not there's an actual financial institution involved there. And a good example is some of the tying we're seeing here, where there's a use of vouchers, or in particular, the most obvious is cryptocurrency. And there's some great work being done by some of the crypto intelligence outfits out there that are helping to plug what is otherwise a pretty big intelligence gap. But maybe over to Sally or Megan for the institutions part of the answer.
Yeah, I would say one of the things that I think is hopefully within the future of this field in a hopeful way is that one thing that we've been telling law enforcement when we talk about our leads and when we talk about the information that we have, I think when we think about the field at large right now, beyond just financial institutions, I mean, obviously, identification is a continued struggle, as it always has been in this field, whether that's victim identification or whether that's suspect identification. And I think one of the true assets to financial intelligence from financial service providers is the fact that we often have so much identity information, right? Because we are working in this side of the space. And that is a little bit different than some of the other platforms involved in this fight. And so I think the continued opportunity is always, how can our information be put together, right? We don't often have those images, and you may need to find those on other platforms. But again, that opportunity for what financial intelligence can bring to the table is often so much of that, not only following the money and building out networks, but also a lot of times true identity information of the people behind this. I think that equally applies, Henry said it well, to the crypto space. And where I would see an opportunity there is, I don't know off the top of my head, this isn't really mine to say, but there aren't many financial service providers or financial institutions reporting to NCMEC. And so I think that's a game changer. I think I'm really proud of Block for beginning reporting last year. There were obviously other institutions that were prior to that, but there are clearly not enough. How can we get more information in to deconflict with that social media information to put these cases together? I see that as a huge future of the space for financial intelligence as an opportunity.
Yeah, and all I would add to that, I think, is just the more you know, it's kind of a common theme. You know, it's knowing that for us in the US, NCMEC has been a key aggregator when it comes to ingesting intelligence from us and others, and being able to use our piece of the puzzle to aggregate that overall story and just strengthen that information to law enforcement. You know, I think if I look in the future, I wish that, it was easy to kind of know where to navigate, and whether you're a financial institution or any other company that may be exposed to this type of activity on your platform, there was an easy process so that we could all work together to be able to share that information and put it in the hands of law enforcement. I think it's important that, we all that are in this field and have awareness of CSAM, that we are we educate as much as we can within our companies to be able to help others understand, what these risks are, and, that you don't want this business on your platform. It's not good for business, and it is also, not good in general. And so everybody can play their part in helping to disrupt this activity, and together we can make a difference.
On the topic of getting more fintech involved in tech and child protection conversations, there's another question. Sally, you mentioned including fintech in the tech/child protection regulatory conversation. What kind of ideas do you have in mind? Do you have any concrete examples you think would be effective policy?
Yes, that is probably a whole separate full webinar, and I'd love to have that. You truly feel free to reach out. I'd love to have that conversation in depth. But I think broadly for this conversation, I think I'm going to keep this answer US centric, but please know that I think it applies again to many countries around the world. I'd be shocked if we found one that it didn't apply to. But I think here in the US, as we pointed out here, we have very specific financial regulators that are not always aligned with the child safety conversation. And so how can we have conversations around work that applies to both child safety and financial regulations in one conversation? I think those roundtables are needed. I also think there's a lot of opportunity for roundtables around whatever the form of reporting is. I think we need alignment in how institutions are reporting when it comes to this content. Again, I think one thing that was interesting for us when we began reporting to the cyber tip line, for example, there are many known standards around what reporting looks like when you're reporting images and when you're reporting chat logs, for example. We kind of are constantly in what makes sense when you're reporting transactions? Where does this information go? And honestly, the forms are very different between cyber tip line reporting and SAR reporting. And so I think there is a lot of alignment that could happen around reporting as well, not only between reporting sources, but between institutions reporting to them. I wonder often if other financial institutions are reporting information in the same way, only because I know that matters to law enforcement who's receiving them and trying to piece together, why does one company report this one way and another? So I would suggest maybe just as some starting places, some conversations around those things.
Thank you, Sally. And conscious of time, I think we can do one more question, and then we move on towards the end of the webinar. So we have one last question. Congrats once again for all the work you're doing. How do you see the growing number of fintechs with low level of compliance, as has been mentioned, been used as financial intermediary for CSAM trading? Here in Brazil, we have a long tail of fintechs. Some of them reported to be directly involved with the organized crime.
Look, it's a challenge. There's no question about it. I don't know if the phrasing "low level of compliance" is maybe the one I identify with, but I understand the thrust of the question. We're seeing a proliferation, unfortunately, both in availability and new types of transacting, sending money to each other internationally or domestically in whatever that domestic jurisdiction may be, at exactly the same time as we're seeing a unfortunate increase in the number of CSAM related cases that have a financial component or abject motivation. And actually in the really smallest volume where there is limited or no predatory interest or sexual motivation, but it is almost entirely financial for an even smaller subset of bad actors. that is one, I think, where what we need to see is an elevation of the efforts in this space that are most proactive. Where Block is leading, others are absolutely following. The more that we can set the standard for institutions in this space, and the more that we do that well ahead of regulations that are playing catch up, be they financial regulators or be they online safety regulators, or be they somewhere in the middle. And I think clearly from what Sally said, it's a bit of all of the above. Of course, it's up to legislators in their own countries to decide what's the right fit for those countries and those regulators and the powers they need. But from a societal point of view, I think the more backing we can give to projects, be they the Tech Coalition's Lantern program, be it the signal sharing that Resolver does by default every day, is a big part of it. And that's probably as much as I want to push on that question.
Thank you very much, Henry. Well, and then with that, I'd like to thank, unless, Megan, would you like to add something? I saw you unmute for a second.
Oh, sorry. I was on mute.
All right. Thank you, everyone who submitted their questions. And thank you so much to our wonderful speakers. Before we completely close off this webinar, as Henry mentioned, this was the last one of this season. So I'd like to thank all of you who've been participating in our sessions. And I especially would like to thank our partner Resolver Trust and Safety for making all of this possible, particularly Henry, Chloe, Danielle, and Shaheen for dedicating your time to these sessions, and our wonderful speakers today, Sally and Megan. And while this series has come to an end, our cooperation with Resolver has not, thankfully, and we're very grateful that they will be supporting the upcoming INHOPE Summit as a sponsor, alongside our partners TikTok, Snap, and Tether. And this year, the summit will be taking place in Washington, D.C. on October 14th and 15th. And as every year, there'll also be a possibility to join online on day one. So if you haven't yet registered, please feel free to scan this QR code to learn more about the event and to sign up. I'll give you a couple of seconds, but otherwise, if you missed the opportunity, you can always visit the INHOPE website and find the event and all of the information there. So thank you for joining. Thank you to our speakers, and I'd like to leave the opportunity to give you the last words.
Thank you, INHOPE. Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you all. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, truly. Thank you guys thank you to everyone who joined, but INHOPE, thank you for your work globally. Resolver, thank you for everything that you were doing and for this great moderation. Henry crushed it. So thanks all.
Thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your day.